So today we're going to be talking about sport-specific training and non-sport specific training for the sport of CrossFit. So something that's interesting is that CrossFit started as a general physical preparedness program, right? So GPP intended to prepare people to take on whatever activity they would wish to take on, whether that was a sport or whether that was just general activities of life. But with the advent of the CrossFit Games, CrossFit itself became a sport. So now there's almost this dichotomy between training for CrossFit as a sport and then also using CrossFit type methodologies in order to create general physical preparedness. So what we're going to talk about today is utilizing movement patterns outside of those seen in CrossFit competition in order to prepare athletes better to compete in CrossFit as a sport. What do you think, John?
Yeah. So, I mean, most of the time, everything we see in CrossFit, pretty linear. Up, down, forward, back, right? Anything side to side is not really going to be seen in the sport. You might see it in your local gym, you might be doing it in your training, but if we're doing competitions, that any kind of movement outside of there is not really seen. I think part of that comes down to how tough it is to test things in that plane. If we're looking at max
judging issues.
Yeah. You can't force people into that plane as easily and stick to a standard for it. Plus the movements that you do through those planes tend not to be testable measures in that sense. So a lot of what you see in competitive CrossFit doesn't relate to real life movement. If you're walking down the street, are you ever just walking in a straight line? No, there's going to be variations in the elevation of the floor, you're going to move side to side. So quite often you'll see CrossFit athletes get injuries that I think can be attributed to that lack of diversity within their training. If you're always pressing up and pressing out with the shoulders, but we're not really doing any rotation, how stable are your shoulders going to be when we give you an uneven load? We give you an overhead yoke carry, we give you a single arm carry, how are you going to be able to cope with that kind of thing?
Yeah, sure. I think something that's really interesting to think about, especially with CrossFit being both a training methodology and a sport, is that with a lot of other sports, there's a pretty clear delineation between, okay, this is the game that we're playing, right? This is our practice where we're actually practicing for that game using the sport, and then here's our strength and conditioning program. And I think CrossFit athletes have all of those things sort of blended. It's like kind of unclear to them, okay, when am I actually competing? When am I practicing my sport? And
Right.
when am I doing strength and conditioning work in order to prepare me better to train and compete?
Yeah. There's no definitive sections within it. You have an element in the off season, but even then, people are doing local competitions, and when is a true off season, and how much does your training actually vary in an off season? For most people, probably not a lot. For the top athletes, there's going to be variation, but I think day to day, people are just doing the same stuff in and out, and it's not conducive to progress necessarily, but it is conducive to overtraining or injury.
Sure. Yeah, and I think that if we look at structuring someone's training, my thought process is always, okay, we need to develop certain physical capacities and physical skills in order to do well in the sport. But simultaneously, we also need to think about what patterns are going to be overutilized in that process of improving in a sport. Then we need to include something to potentially mitigate that damage, right? So, if you just think about, let's say, a baseball pitcher, right? That person is going to be doing all kinds of throwing motions and rotation, and that baseball pitcher, in order to pitch well, does need to actually get good rotational speed and power. However, they're doing so much pitching that they may or may not benefit from actually training that movement over and over again in the gym, right? It's not like you have baseball pitchers where it's like, all right, man, here's what we're going to do. We're going to give you a weighted ball, and you're just going to go rotate really fast like this over and over and over again, right? That there may be deficits in that pattern that need to be trained in the gym, but the reality is that a lot of baseball pitchers are going to need to be doing stuff supplemental in the gym to undo the overuse and the common patterns and issues that they see from repeatedly going into that same pattern in their practice and in their game.
Right. And how often do we see in CrossFit someone doing something like a max snatch where they hurt their knee or hurt their shoulder because they didn't pull perfectly and that bar moves around on them slightly? How much anti-rotational work do athletes do? How much bracing work do they do to avoid that kind of situation where they're moving a heavy load and it moves on them in a way they're not expecting. And I think the importance of that stability and anti-rotational and correctional work carries over a lot when you get into a high intensity or into a fatigue state.
Sure, I mean, you can essentially utilize these non-traditional patterns to build resilience.
Yep.
Right? That the goal is to enable someone to succeed in something like a snatch by giving them a lot of buffer on either side of that movement, right? Where it's like, okay, cool. If you catch that bar a little bit forward, or you catch that bar a little bit backward, or you end up in a position that's not perfect, you should have resilience built into the system so that you can either save the lift if you need to, or not injure yourself just because you're not in the exact spot you expected to be.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a lot of value to that, and whether it's overlooked by a lot of people, I don't know. But shoulder injuries, how many times does someone injure their shoulder doing high volume pull-ups or high volume pressing work, and then they go to a PT, and a lot of the PT work is rotational rehabilitation. So, well, we need to create stability around the joint. Why are we not doing rotational work as a prehab as opposed to a rehab?
Sure. Yeah, and in terms of structuring this, I mean, how do you add this into training for your athletes?
A lot of the time I'll have it in as specific strength work, predominantly in the off season. So single arm, single leg work, whether it's pushing, pulling, rotational. A lot of isometric work that is, again, kind of unilateral. So single arm planks or hanging from a bar with one arm. Doing lateral movements like Cossack squats or lateral step ups or things like that. So anything that you can put in as a strength piece or as a isometric accumulating time, generally in the off season. That's when I'm programming.
Sure. Yeah, and this can also just look like standard accessory work.
Yep.
Right. It can be, okay, you're going to do back squats as your main strength piece for the day, and then after that you may do something with cross under step downs and some form of lateral sled dragging as accessory work, right? So it just kind of feels like a typical accessory work session, but the goal is to think about, okay, we have this large sagittal plane dominant movement, and then we want to incorporate some additional patterns on top of that in a given day's work.
Yep.
So it just kind of fits seamlessly into training there.
Yep.
Something else that I often do, especially for athletes who are more competitive and need to do high volumes of training to compete in the sport, is utilize this type of non-traditional CrossFit type of training as a way to add volume in, right? Because for those athletes, tolerance to volume is a key indicator for success, right? They have to be able to do a certain number of repetitions of chest to bar pull-ups and squat snatches and wall balls and double unders over a handful of days in order to get through the open, and then also, especially if they should be moving on to regionals, they're going to have 3 days of definitely high intensity, and depending on the year and the actual workout, potentially very high volume of contractions, right? So these athletes need to be able to tolerate a lot of knee flexion contractions, right? There's going to be tons of squatting. They need to be able to handle tons of upper body pushing and pulling, right? I mean, if you look at regionals last year, it's like how many ring dips did these people do over a few days, right? We look at previous years, it's like how many pull-ups and toes to bar and muscle-ups and legless rope climbs that they do over a few days, and plus a whole bunch of power cleans, so they're gripping the whole time. So the amount of contractions they have to be able to tolerate is, it's obscene, right? So how do we want to train that? Well, we could train it by just having them do that number of reps of chest to bar and power clean all the time, but as we've discussed, that often results in people going down sort of a negative rabbit hole, right? So not necessarily overtraining, and some people can just tolerate it. They're just good, they're resilient, they can handle it. But for other people, you have to keep in those sport-specific movements, right, which is their practice, and then you can add in this volume of training that's going to set them up to succeed under those higher volumes of contractions by doing more stuff in, say, an AM session or as accessory work, where it's like, cool, you're going to do hand over hand sled pulls, you're going to do single arm kettlebell farmer's walks, right? You're going to do bottoms up kettlebell carries, you're going to do commando pull-ups, you're going to do monkey bar style things, because you're still training all this gripping type of stuff, but you're not necessarily doing it just in chest to bar pull-ups and legless rope climbs.
Right. Yeah. No, it's a great way to do it.
So, I don't know if I have anything else to say, Joe.
I think that concludes our video for today. If you have any questions, email us or slide in his DMs.
I don't check them.